It wasn't a summit, it was a setup when Ibrahim Traoré walked into the bright, polished Washington Forum Hall. He could feel something was off. The lights were too harsh, the stage too small, and the welcome felt fake, like it had all been planned out. He knew right away this wasn't a real conversation, it was about power and control. The banner said partnerships for global stability, but the room felt more like a trap. Cameras followed his every move, and the panel full of Western leaders wasn't there to listen, just to corner him. Right in the center sat Karoline Leavitt, a strong conservative voice from New Hampshire. She didn't even stand to greet him. Instead, she looked at the audience and said into the mic, "Let's be clear, Africa owes its structure to us. We made the rules, and those rules aren't up for debate." The crowd gave a short, fake laugh. Traoré didn't react. He calmly adjusted his uniform and sat down. No anger, no reaction, just deep silence, so still it even made the cameraman pause. The moderators glanced at each other, waiting for Traoré to defend himself, to argue, to fall into their trap, but he didn't. Karoline leaned in with a smirk and said, "Mr. Traoré, are you here to cooperate or keep pretending to resist?" People turned to see how he'd react. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'm not here to play your game, and I never agreed to your rules." The room went still. It wasn't loud, but it hit hard. His voice was full of certainty. Karoline didn't know what to say. She expected drama, not quiet strength. Now, the attention had shifted to him. Karoline leaned back, forcing a smile. "You may not like the rules," she said, "but without them, you'd have no voice, no power. We built the systems you use today." Traoré looked right at her and replied, "What you built was a cage, shiny, but locked, and now that we're walking out of it, you call it rebellion. That wasn't part of the plan." The moderator jumped in quickly, trying to calm things down. "Let's stay on track. This is a discussion about cooperation, not conflict." But the crowd, especially the young students sitting in the back, was hooked. This wasn't just another speech, it was a shift. Traoré had flipped the room, and Karoline could feel it. She crossed her arms and said sharply, "You talk like we owe you something. But the global system isn't built on feelings. It's built on strength, control, and leadership." "American leadership," Traoré repeated softly, tilting his head. "Is that what you call it, leadership?" Karoline raised an eyebrow. "And what would you call it?" He leaned forward, calm but firm. "Extraction, control, dressed up as charity." The room stirred. Some looked uncomfortable, others more alert. Karoline narrowed her eyes. "You sound like someone who wants chaos." Traoré didn't blink. "No, I want something you've forgotten how to recognize." "And what's that?" she asked. "Freedom," he said. "Not permission, not dependence, real freedom." The moderator tried to pull the conversation back to the planned topics, but it was too late. The audience had already shifted. They were now following Traoré's words like a trail leading somewhere deeper. Karoline glanced at the cameras, sensing the control slipping away. She had come prepared to dominate the stage, but Traoré hadn't just stepped out of the trap, he had redrawn the battlefield. None of the pre-written headlines like Leavitt School's African leader or U.S. leadership holds the line. Match what was unfolding. Something bigger was happening, an illusion breaking, a narrative shaking. Karoline tried to take back control. "Mr. Traoré, with all due respect, your country depends on international aid. The U.S. has helped build your roads, your security, your economy. That's not control, it's responsibility." Traoré nodded once and replied, "And what comes with that responsibility? Loans with interest, deals with strings, military support that comes with a blood cost. You don't help us rise, you teach us how to bow." The crowd reacted, gasps, whispers, even a few solemn nods from African students in the back. Karoline snapped, "Then why are you even here? If we're the problem, why use our platform?" Traoré paused, not because he was unsure, but because he knew the weight of what he'd say next. "Because I'm not afraid of your platform, and I won't let the world only hear your version of the truth." No one clapped, no one shouted, but the silence that followed was full of thought, tension, and reflection. The moderator shifted awkwardly, trying to steer things toward solutions. But Karoline wasn't finished. Her voice turned colder. "You think defiance is leadership? You think being loud makes you strong. Real leadership follows the rules. Traoré looked her straight in the eye and said, real leadership rewrites the rules when they were never fair. That line didn't just land, it shook the room. In the control booth, a producer leaned in and quietly said, he's winning the room. Karoline sat up straighter, still looking confident, but there was something different in her eyes now. She wasn't leading the debate anymore. She was reacting to it. Her fingers tapped the desk nervously, and that confident smile she started with was now gone. What was meant to be a show of American authority had slowly shifted the crowd's attention. The energy, the focus, it all moved to Traoré. Realizing it, Karoline changed her strategy and turned to the oldest trick in politics, fear. You talk about freedom, she said sharply, but under your leadership, journalists are jailed, dissidents disappear, and your so-called independence looks a lot like authoritarian rule. It was the moment she'd been waiting for. The accusation meant to corner him. If he stayed quiet, it would seem true. If he got angry, the headlines would write themselves. But Traoré didn't react. Instead, he turned to the audience and asked, do you know what happens when a country tries to free itself from a system built to keep it obedient? It gets called unstable, dangerous, authoritarian. Not because it lacks rules, but because it stopped following theirs. A professor in the back uncrossed his arms. Two students whispered and nodded to each other. Karoline leaned in, trying to push harder. So you're saying the global community can't hold leaders accountable? No, Traoré replied calmly. I'm saying real accountability starts with honesty. And the West hasn't been honest, not in its wars, not in its loans, not in its media, not in its missions. The room stirred. Someone sighed heavily in the third row. Karoline raised her voice, frustration showing. Without our system, your country's economy would collapse, your power would crumble. You wouldn't even be on that stage without us. That's when Traoré stood up, not in anger, not in haste, but with calm purpose. He looked across the room and said, I existed before your cameras saw me. My people existed before your maps named us. And we will still exist long after your headlines are forgotten. He didn't need to shout. His presence filled the room. Karoline stayed seated, lips pressed together, eyes narrowed. She had tried to throw him off, but all she did was make his quiet strength louder. Realizing the debate was slipping further from her grasp, she went personal, trying to mock, trying to humiliate. With a cold smile, she asked, tell me, Mr. Traoré, how many satellites has your government launched? How many global patents? How many Nobel Prizes? You talk about freedom, but what have you actually built? A few people in the front row chuckled, the kind of laugh meant to sting. It was a direct shot meant to embarrass him, aiming straight at his pride. Karoline's comment hung in the air, but Traoré didn't flinch or smile. He calmly walked to the edge of the stage and paused. Everyone watched closely, unsure if he'd fire back or step down. Then he spoke. We don't measure our worth in satellites, he said. We measure it in soil, in soul, in survival. The room fell silent. You built machines, he continued. We built endurance. You reached the moon. We held onto our roots you tried to rip out. And while you were filing patents, we were burying the bodies, your weapons, your coups, and your projects left behind. Karoline jumped in quickly, her voice sharper now. So you admit it, you're behind. That's why we lead. But Traoré didn't blink. You lead in numbers. We lead in memory. You call us behind. I call us unchained. It wasn't a comeback, it was a complete shift in perspective. He wasn't defending himself, he was redefining the entire frame. The moderator tried to shift the conversation back to policy. Let's return to trade, he said. But Traoré turned to him and replied, no trade is fair when it's built on theft. Karoline clenched her jaw. She had tried to use numbers, rankings, and reputation to shake him. But she'd forgotten that real power isn't always in statistics, it's in self-respect. And on that stage, Traoré had more of it than anyone in the room, determined. Karoline raised her voice with patriotic pride. America isn't perfect, she said, but we're a force for good. We give aid. We spread democracy. We build alliances. And when people cry for help, we answer. Some in the crowd clapped. Cameras zoomed in. Flags applause. the right optics, but Traoré stood calmly and let the noise pass. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, not loud, but sharp. Your aid, he said, comes with strings. Your democracy comes with exceptions. And your coalitions, they always show up where there's something you want. Oil, gold, lithium. Control. Karoline crossed her arms. So you reject our help. I reject the mask, Traoré said. If help means surrender, it's not help, it's leverage. He looked around the room. You call yourselves a force for good, but who gets to define that good? The giver or the one who has to live with it? No one moved. He continued. From where we stand, your goodness built empires. It dropped bombs. It erased our languages, drew your borders, silenced our leaders, and then rewrote the story to make it sound noble. The silence in the room now was deep, uncomfortable, and honest. Karoline tried to cut through it, her tone sharp. You talk about history like everything's our fault. Traoré nodded slowly and said, not everything is your fault, but enough is. Enough to take responsibility, enough to listen. That line hit home. Even some of the American students lowered their heads, not because they were ashamed, but because they understood. He kept speaking, calm and clear. I don't hate America. I hate the silence that follows when America is wrong. The moderator looked shaken. This wasn't just a panel discussion anymore. It felt like a mirror held up to power, and what reflected back wasn't anger, but honesty. Karoline tried to change the mood. Her voice became more serious, more formal. Every system has problems, she said, but without global order, there's chaos. You don't fix the world by tearing apart what keeps it standing. It was her final card, the argument for stability. Traoré stepped forward and replied, order depends on whose peace it protects and whose pain it ignores. Then he turned to the audience. Ask yourselves, what has this global order done for the farmers trapped in debt by IMF loans they never agreed to? For the kids mining cobalt for cars they'll never ride in? For the presidents who got overthrown after saying no to foreign banks? He wasn't loud, but every word landed like a drumbeat. Karoline tried again. It's easy to criticize. Building something is harder. Traoré nodded. You're right. But we are building just not copies of your systems. We're growing something of our own. A student stood and asked, then why does the media say you're dangerous? Traoré didn't pause. Because power doesn't fear chaos. It fears independence. It fears the day we stop asking for permission. He glanced toward Karoline. Not as an attack, but as a reminder. This isn't about me and her. It's about truth versus comfort. Real history versus a nice story. Freedom versus control disguised as help. Karoline clenched her jaw. If everyone rewrites the rules, she asked, what's left? Traoré looked straight at her and answered, justice. That's what should have been there from the start. The room shifted. No claps. Just a quiet feeling, something deeper than applause. Karoline had tried to scare people with the idea of collapse, but Traoré had shown what was already broken. Then she played her last move, smiling slightly. Mr. Traoré, do you really think you're changing anything? You stand alone, she said. No major powers support you. Your so-called independence has left you isolated. It was meant to hurt, a reminder that power in their world is measured by alliances and wealth. But Traoré didn't even flinch. He looked at the audience, then calmly back at her, alone. He said, no, I stand with those who remember the true cost of dignity, and that's not something you can see on your maps. He stepped forward, his tone steady. You think isolation means weakness, but maybe you haven't noticed more and more countries are stepping out of your orbit. Not into chaos, but into choice. The room fell silent, the kind of silence where everyone is thinking deeply. You call it isolation when we walk away from the table you built, but maybe we've just stopped pretending it was ever built for us. Karoline's calm started to crack. You won't win with slogans, she snapped. You're romanticizing rebellion while real people are suffering. Traoré nodded. And we've suffered quietly under your system for decades. But now that we're speaking, you call it rebellion. He paused. You say I stand alone. Maybe it's just that you refuse to see who's standing behind me. The moderator tried to cut in. We're almost out of time, but no one cared. A young African-American woman in the front stood up and said clearly, let him finish. Others nodded. The moderator backed off. Traoré looked at Karoline one last time. "You still think you make the rules," he said, "but the world isn't playing your game anymore." The camera caught the look on her face, a flash of frustration, maybe even realization. She had tried to make him look small, but he had become something else entirely, a reflection of change, and the audience could feel it. Just minutes earlier, Karoline had walked on that stage confident, with the lighting, the script, the setup all in her favor. She had the headlines written before a word was spoken. It was supposed to be her moment. But now, she was leaning forward, tense, not because Traoré shouted, but because he didn't need to. Not because he insulted her, he never did, but because he changed the entire atmosphere in the room. The moderator offered him one final minute. "Closing remarks," he said. Karoline motioned for Traoré to go first. Traoré stepped to the front of the stage, not to confront her, but to speak directly to the audience. "I was told this room represents leadership, power, the ability to shape the future," he said, glancing briefly at the cameras. "But real leadership doesn't come from comfort. It doesn't keep repeating the same rules written by the same hands for centuries." He paused. "Leadership is the courage to break the pattern." Then, turning briefly toward Karoline, he added, "I'm not here for approval or correction or warnings. I'm here because the world is no longer your chessboard." In the media section, a journalist stopped writing. "I don't need permission to exist outside your logic." Traoré continued, "I don't need validation from those who forgot how they got their thrones. And I will never apologize for standing tall." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was powerful. Karoline began to respond, but her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and recovered. But the moment had already passed. She had come to control the conversation. But now she was simply part of Traoré's story. As the forum came to an end, applause rippled through the room, some polite, some uncertain, but in the back rows, where the thinkers and students sat, the reaction was clear. Something had shifted. Karoline gathered her notes stiffly, her team rushing in to whisper strategies. She'd debated before, but this was different. Traoré hadn't just argued, he had ignored the script, broken the posture, and shattered the illusion. She had planned to put him in his place, but he had never been in her system to begin with. Traoré didn't stay for the spotlight. He shook a few hands, nodded politely to the moderator, and exited through a side door like a man not chasing headlines, but leaving them in his wake. As he walked down the hallway, a young intern hurried up behind him, out of breath. "Sir," she said, a little out of breath, "I just wanted to tell you what you said really mattered." He smiled, not like someone who had won a fight, but like someone who refused to lose on someone else's terms. Outside, the air was cool. There were no flashing cameras, no speeches, just quiet footsteps and purpose. Back inside, Karoline sat in the dimly lit press room, going over the moment again and again, not just the words, but the feeling of losing control. The shift in the room, the way power slipped away. Her advisor leaned over and said, "We'll fix the headlines," but she wasn't sure it mattered anymore, because something had changed. And it didn't change through force, but through quiet refusal. The man she tried to frame as small had walked out with something bigger than applause. He walked out with truth, around the world, from classrooms to offices. His words echoed louder than any speech. "You don't own the board, Karoline, and I don't play your game," in a room built to control him. Ibrahim Traoré didn't ask for space, he claimed it. He didn't raise his voice or beg for approval. He stood firm, not to argue, but to remind everyone watching that true power doesn't come from speaking louder, it comes from refusing to be silenced. Karoline thought she controlled the moment, but Traoré proved that sometimes the most powerful move is not playing by their rules at all. If this story moved you, don't just watch it, share it, speak it, stand behind it, because this is the untold state, and this was just the beginning.